Here we see these crazy airspeed indications. And here we see he is bringing the nose. Here's his, this is very important. This is his elevator inputs. So this kind of seems backwards, but he's basically pulling the nose up. And in response, the angle of attack is increasing. The plane is going up. It's gaining altitude rapidly. Within a few seconds, in fact, he's increasing his altitude and decreasing his speed and increasing it more crucially, his angle of attack, so dramatically that the plane triggers an alarm. Stall, stall. This is the English word stall is blaring and blaring and blaring into the cockpit. 22 seconds in, 22 seconds after the computer turned itself off, they've climbed 1,000 feet and they're ascending at a rate of 7,000 feet per minute. And as a Cessna pilot, I can tell you there's a certain element of jealousy in that. So what should they have done? So he's rolling the plane vigorously right and left. He's putting in a nose-up input. He's climbing the plane. What should he have done? Well, obviously, what he should have done is, A, first of all, nothing. Because all that had happened at this point was some ice had gotten into that tiny little hole at the front of the pitot tube. So that's the problem, a tiny, tiny piece of ice. They just don't know how fast they're going. You can be driving down the highway and you can imagine you lose your speedometer. It doesn't matter, you're still driving the car. Similarly, the engines are working fine. There's nothing structurally wrong with the airframe. They're just flying along. If he just hadn't touched the controls at all, they would have continued flying as they were. Next thing that they should do is think about it, pull out the checklist for unreliable airspeed indication and just go through that. And then that hopefully will help you solve your problem. These kinds of problems can and do occur all the time. It's a relatively minor issue in a sense. But obviously, in a sense, it's not because it triggered a catastrophic chain of events. So, we have to ask ourselves, this is the part of the whole equation that seems the most baffling. Why did Bonin pull back on the stick? And we don't really know. I mean, we can speculate. There's something instinctive. I think, again, many pilots have had the experience of approaching terrain that they feel would be very bad for their health to impact, and you sort of instinctively pull back on the stick. Then again, we know that Bonin wanted to climb. He wanted to get above the weather. He didn't have the performance capability to get above the weather, but he wished he did. So we find him sort of instinctively, automatically climbing the plane. He might not even have been aware of it. We have no way of knowing. In fact, we'll see later that there's some indication that he didn't know what was happening. But there was a lot of comment in the press coverage, including by me, that one of the first things a pilot learns in an incipient stall situation is put the nose down. Don't pull back on the stick. And yet that's exactly what he did. And it's hard to understand how someone who, he may have been the junior flight officer on this particular flight crew, but he had many thousands of hours of experience, and it seems like kind of a newbie mistake. Also kind of remarkable along the same line is that neither he nor anyone else at any point mentions the fact that there's a stall warning blaring in their faces. And this points again to an interesting aspect of human factors. When you lose the trust in one instrument, you lose the trust in all of them. So it may simply have been that they didn't believe the stall warning. Now, after all, they lost their airspeed indication. Airspeed is related to stall, right? Well, as we all know, airspeed isn't directly linked to stall. The critical factor in stall is angle of attack. And the stall warning is triggered by an angle of attack sensor. We now know today that the angle of attack sensor was working fine. The stall horn was accurate. They were actually on the verge of stall. And so if they had listened to this voice that was blaring in their ears, they would have known their problem would have been solved for them. So this becomes a really interesting problem in human factors. How do you tell someone the truth when they're in a situation where they don't trust anything anymore? There's some other interesting psychological factors. When you're in a situation, you experience a situation called cognitive tunneling. So you only focus on what is directly in your consciousness at that moment. You also tend to ignore stimuli that are novel or unfamiliar or untrustworthy. All of these things apply to the stall warning. So now 22 seconds go by. They're getting rapidly out of their flight envelope. And Robert, who's watching this, says, speaking kind of as the voice of experience in the situation, pay attention to your speed. He's probably referring to vertical speed, which, as I mentioned, is a blistering 7,000 feet per minute. And Bonin answers, okay, I'm descending. And if we look again at the data, the roll is still going on. He's still doing this pilot-induced oscillation, but it's getting less. The angle of attack actually is getting less. The rate of climb is being reduced dramatically. However, they're still climbing. And Robert several times admonishes him, "You're climbing. You're still climbing." Bonin says, "No, I'm not. I'm okay. I'm doing it. I'm putting the nose down now." "No, you're not." "Okay, now I am." So there's, I mentioned earlier this human factors aspect of who's in charge of this cockpit. We have this sort of bickering going on. This is not optimal in a crisis. The airspeed comes back. Now, just before they entered this weather, somewhat fortuitously, Robert had turned on some anti-icing protection. And now it kicks in. So, as we see in the next slide here, this shows when the pitot tubes were frozen up. And while they're frozen, you're getting all this crazy gibberish here. And then one of them comes back, and the other one comes back. So now you have two pitot tubes giving good speed indications. Unfortunately, the speed indications are not telling you something very positive. You're losing airspeed rapidly. So they talk about descending. They don't actually descend, but their situation is stabilizing. They're actually back in the flight envelope. The stall warning horn stops blaring for a while, but they're still climbing. At this point, this is one of these moments where history could have gone the other way. If the captain had come back a little earlier, perhaps, or if Robert had been more aggressive in taking over the controls, or if Bonin had just somehow managed to calm himself, if they could have just kept on doing what they were doing at that moment, the ending would have been very different. But soon after, now a minute has elapsed, Bonin once again pulls back on the stick, commands pitch up. So the angle of attack once again increases. But they're not climbing anymore. In fact, they've now entered a stall.
Is it still an alternate law?
Yeah. It never gets back to normal law. Yeah. So, great point. They are still an alternate law. The airplane is now stalled. The thrust levers are full forward. They're in go-around mode, so the full thrust. The elevator is basically, where am I here? All the way up. They're in a full nose up. Control surfaces are commanding a full control up. The engines are at full blast. Bonin is holding them like this, holding the nose up as they start to sink back towards the ground. So anyway, now this is when it gets really confusing for the pilots, because they don't feel like they should be sinking. Again, they don't know that they're stalled, and so if you don't know that you're stalled and your plane is at full power, and your angle of attack may be huge, but your pitch angle isn't that high. I mean, they're slightly up, high single digits maybe. And yet here they are, losing altitude increasingly fast. And so they start to fall. Robert says, but we've got the engines. What's happening? And Bonin says, I don't have control of the plane. I don't have control of the plane at all. And what happens around the time he says this, now that they're stalled, the plane is not moving very quickly through the air. You lose control authority on your flight control surfaces. And so the ailerons lose their effectiveness. He's unable now to dampen these roll oscillations, and the plane rolls all the way over to the right. So he says, I have no, this is very freaky to him. This seems much freakier than having the nose up too high. They're pitched over at a steep angle of bank. Robert finally says, left seat taking control. So finally, the more senior of the two takes control, and he's in charge. However, unfortunately, he doesn't understand either what's happening. He doesn't believe the stall horn either. And so he also commands nose up.
Is the stall horn still on?
Sorry?
Is the stall horn still on?
The stall warning horn is on. It goes on and off throughout the incident, but I think at this point it's on. Yeah?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
So were they not paying attention to the artificial horizon and the altitude indicators as well?
Well, as I said, we don't know what they were looking at, but they don't mention it. The things they do talk about are vertical speed, and they, they don't talk about it. So we don't really know what they're looking at, but they don't trust anything probably. Yeah.
No stick shaker, no stick pusher?
No.
They don't have it. Not in the air. It's not in the plane.
I'm glad you guys can answer these questions without me, because I'm sure you're have much more experience actually than me. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, in the Airbus's current configuration during flight, what would its stall speed be?
That's the kind of thing that you need the computer to calculate, because it changes depending on the altitude and so forth.
Probably not more than 10 or 20 knots above stall at their cruise.
Right. So you're getting into kind of a narrow window of performance, which is why they were limited to how far they could go. Let me just take one more, and then maybe we can do more questions at the end. Yeah.
I'm actually type rated on the A330.
Oh.